Welcome, everyone, to the first in our lecture series in fall 2021, known as Sentience. This is a lecture series co-sponsored by the Center for Sensory Studies and the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture at Concordia University. To introduce us to our speaker today is Dr. David Howes, who is the co-director of the Center for Sensory Studies, a professional anthropologist, but also a professor of anthropology at Concordia University. Take it away, David.
Thank you very much, Joe, for the introduction. And indeed, I would like to extend the thanks of the Center to the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture for having made this lecture series possible. This is the second time we've been collaborating. Last year, we put on a series called Atmospheres, and this year, we turn our attention to sentience. And indeed, we expect to probe, to explore the far borderlands of sentience in the course of this series. We will range across numerous other kingdoms and indeed take in the extraordinary varieties of this form of awareness we call sentience. So it's my great pleasure today to begin the series by having with us Jonathan Balcombe. And Jonathan is an ethologist and of numerous books, and I'm not going to even begin to list all of them. He is formerly the director of animal sentience with the Humane Society Institute for Science and Policy, and the department chair for animal studies with the Humane Society University. Today, he actually makes his home in Southern Ontario, which is something of a return for him, in that he actually earned a Bachelor of Science degree from York University in 1983, and then went on to do a Master's of Science at Carleton University. From there, he completed a PhD in ethology at the University of Tennessee. Now, he is the author of many books that have really shaken up our understanding of sentience and of animal-human relations. Indeed, he has strived on numerous occasions to really change our understanding of our relations with animals. And so, for example, Pleasurable Kingdom is one of his books. And it's about animals and the nature of feeling good. And for those of us who thought that animals, are engaged in a constant struggle for survival, it was really a sobering and enlightening and joyous revelation to actually explore the varieties of pleasure that animals experience, that animals see. His 2016 book, What a Fish Knows, was on the New York Times bestseller list, and indeed is a remarkable to some of the themes that he will be addressing today. And in turn, I'd like to note the publication not long ago of Superfly, The Unexpected Lives of the World's Most Successful Insects, which will also be providing some of the material that he will be drawing on in this talk. So I'd like to note that the Q&A function is enabled, so you're welcome to record your question on the Q&A anytime during the talk, and I will be asking the questions on your behalf when the question and answer period begins. So you're welcome to leave your questions for me to look over and present, Jonathan, anytime. The chat function has been disabled because that's just one too many channels. If I had to do the Q&A and the chat at the same time, my brain would implode. And so please bear with me and my bandwidth and direct your questions through the Q&A. And so without further ado, it's my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Jonathan and hear his presentation on sentience from fishes, flies.
David, thank you for that introduction and for the invitation to to speak in this series. It's an honor to be the first one, and I'm really glad to see the growing attention to the phenomenon of sentience. It's something that is so important and needs to be discussed. So I will now share screen. Okay, everybody can see this slide okay? Okay, great. I've always loved all animals, and I've noticed that the more we know about them, the more we tend to underestimate them. And David mentioned my two most recent books, and the talk that I'm giving today is going to take some highlights from these books and to use the information to hopefully raise the status of these animals, hopefully surprise you a bit and show you that we have underestimated them. I'll focus primarily on feelings. Sentience would be a more formal term for that, loosely. Intelligence, cognition, interrelationships, and the implications. As an advocate for animals, I think it's important, it certainly is to me, to put the information I share in the context of our evolving and hopefully improving relationship with other animals. So let's start with fishes then. Globally, we tend to think of fishes in one of two contexts, mostly as a source of food, and certainly in developed countries as a source of recreation, dare I say, pleasure. But today, I want to invite you to see fishes through a different lens. The first thing I want to impress upon you is that we are actually living in an age of fishes. The age of mammals peaked a few million years ago, whereas the fishes have flourished in recent millennia. And now we have well over 33,000 described species. I think that's an important qualifier because there's probably a few thousand that we haven't described, certainly a few dozen most years being discovered. And as you can guess, with that diversity, there's a huge range of shapes and sizes. But because they're all kind of generally streamlined for swimming in water, we call them collectively fishes. This is a little bit selling them short because there's two major groups of fishes. All of the ones here are the bony fishes, or the teleosts, for the exception of two, which is the shark and the electric ray in the top left. They are cartilaginous fishes. And these two groups are as different from each other as birds are from mammals, but we conveniently call them all fishes. So let's start with feelings, or sentience could be loosely tied to that word. Pain is something that has been debated a lot, and certainly there are still some academics who will deny that fishes feel pain, but careful experiments done, for instance, on trout, fully anesthetized, terminally anesthetized trout, in which they showed that they have three different kinds of nociceptors as we do, sensitive to mechanical, heat, and chemical pain. And that those nociceptors send signals to the brain, and it changes the behavior of the fishes. Non-anesthetized fishes who've been injected with acid in the lips, for instance, will stop eating for some time, and as they recover from the pain, they start to rub their mouths against the gravel at the bottom of the tank or on the tank walls and this sort of thing. They also, when they're in the midst of what appears to be their pain experience, they're distracted and they're not as vigilant of danger as they normally would be. So these things are somewhat open to interpretation, but collectively these studies, which were summarized in a 2010 book by Victoria Braithwaite called "Do Fish Feel Pain?" ? Collectively, these studies quite compellingly support pain in fishes. A different approach, a study by Lynn Snedden of zebrafishes, showed that these little fishes will pay a cost to receive pain relief after being injected with acid. They will swim into a part of a complex tank, a chamber where they would normally avoid it because it's brightly lit, there's nowhere to hide, but because the scientists had dribbled in and diffused some painkillers, a lidocaine, in that part of the tank, they're willing to pay the cost of being in a relatively unsafe environment to get the pain relief. A control group of fishes, among them who were injected with relatively benign saline, didn't swim over to this corner of the tank where lidocaine had been released. I find these results quite compellingly supportive of what we we really probably should assume all along, which is that a complex vertebrate animal who can move away from bad things and towards good things can feel pain. And the flip side, as David mentioned, I've done some writing about animal pleasure. I think it's been a relatively neglected subject that deserves much more attention. On the flip side of pain, there are fishes such as this Nassau grouper who will approach trusted divers to receive gentle caresses. There's quite a lot of evidence from several corners, and I will return briefly to this in a little bit. Evidence and support that fishes can and do feel pleasure, and certainly the pleasure of touch seems to be something that they like. Connected to this, a study of stress that I found equally compelling to the pain studies I mentioned earlier, a study of striated surgeonfishes collected from their wild homes on the Great Barrier Reef, subjected to further stress by being placed for 30 minutes in a bucket of shallow water. You can measure their stress by taking blood from the caudal vein, that caudal peduncle just in front of the tail, draw blood, and you can measure cortisol, the stress hormone, and find that these fishes were extremely highly stressed. And then they were divided into two groups, and in the experimental group at the top, they were given the opportunity to swim up to a realistic model of a cleaner wrasse who was attached to a motor that created a sweeping motion. Suffice to say, these fishes, if they wanted, could get gentle strokes and caresses, which is relevant to their wild situation because cleaner wrasses will clean them on cleaning stations on the reef, and they will sometimes take a break from cleaning and give them a massage by fluttering their pectoral fins, presumably to make them glad that they went for their services. In the bottom control group, there was the same situation, except there was no motor and therefore no opportunity to get any strokes because the model cleaner fish was stationary; it wouldn't move. And in the top treatment, on these stress surgeon fishes averaged 15 visits to that mobile cleaner fish per hour. So they got strokes 15 times, and their stress levels dropped markedly. In the control group, they couldn't get caresses, and they ignored the cleaner wrasse. They visited 0 times per hour. So a striking contrast in the response. Once again, and by the way, in the bottom group, their stress levels didn't decline. So this is another quite inventive and I think quite surprising study that shows that these animals can feel stress and they have the wherewithal to relieve their stress. I'm happy to say that all those surgeonfishes were released back into their homes on the Great Barrier Reef following the study. Another study involving just 3 subjects, 3 individually housed male cichlids. There's many species of cichlids. This one obviously has got some lovely blue colors. And each male it was noticed, this wasn't part of the study, they were there for some other reason, but the scientists noticed that these male cichlids would interact idiosyncratically, each one differently, with a semi-buoyant thermometer. It was the only thing that they could really kind of interact with, except for hiding in the rocks. And one of them would nudge it up against the corner of the tank and sort of box it. It was speculated that these fishes got some entertainment out of this, and it fit the formal criteria for play. And perhaps it's because the thermometer could bounce back and forth and look like it was trying to hit them back and they could dodge it. That was one speculation as to why they were doing this. I think another emotion, if we can call it that, should be mentioned here, the possibility of boredom. And there has been some studies, Francoise Wemmelsfelder, for instance, has studied boredom in animals, usually in the context of the pork animals we call livestock, who are stuck in factory farms with no stimulation at all. So there's the suggestion from this study, the one with the cichlids, that there's play behavior, and there's growing evidence for that, not so much formal, but mostly anecdotal, and also the possibility of boredom in a fish. And certainly the way there's a growing clamor against the crowded, stressful, chronically stressful and confined conditions, thwarting conditions, pesticide-ridden conditions, often parasite-ridden conditions, etc., where these fishes have no control, and there's growing clamor of objection to the trials and tribulations for these animals who appear to be emotional and easily stressed. To wit, in one study published a few years ago, a research team in Norway looked at the phenomenon called dropouts, which are young salmon who give up and just become hyper-stressed very high levels of cortisol. They fail to thrive. They can't compete with the competition. And this is a dropout on the bottom. It's the same age fish as the one on the top. And these dropouts, they just give up. They don't feed. They die of malnutrition. They float to the surface. And they were, in this particular study, the scientists concluded that they were, and I quote, severely depressed. It's considered an acceptable level of loss in the industry of 30% loss to dropout. So these are not rarities. This is a very commonplace condition that these fishes suffer in captivity. Going to move on now to intelligence, and there's certainly quite a lot of studies showing that fishes are far beyond what we tend to think of them being in terms of awareness, cognition, etc. So a few examples here, including tool use. Even though fishes are not equipped with manipulative hands, they have brains and they have body parts they can use, and they will use their mouths. This tuskfish here on the right has used water as a tool to blow sand away and uncover an unfortunate clam who's then being grasped in the mouth and is now being transported, or has just been transported, to a particular rock or piece of coral. I suspect these fishes have their favorite anvils in the reef area, and then with a series of well-timed and coordinated head flicks and releases is able to smash open the clam and get the contents inside. So the rock is being used as an anvil. And note the bystanders on the left, or perhaps we should call them by-swimmers, fishes of several species who are watching and waiting, alert to an opportunity to get some of the spoils once the fish on the right has opened the clam. By the way, a lot of these phenomena that I'm describing can be watched on YouTube videos. There was a first publication of this behavior. And there's a nice video shot by the biologist who actually filmed and documented. It was the first case of this documented on film. The fishes have probably been doing it for millennia, and there's probably many species doing this sort of thing. It's just only in relative recent times, with the advent of underwater cinematography and scuba gear and the like, that we're beginning to notice these things that they've been doing all along. Another case, fishes are often demeaned for their poor memories. But in fact, they have excellent memories. They have excellent recognition systems as well, as I'll get to momentarily. But let's talk about the frill-finned goby, a little 4-inch long fish of the Atlantic coastline around the world, well, around the Atlantic anyway. And these fishes live in the intertidal zone. So at low tide, they're in these tide pools. And people had noticed that they're able to leap from one tide pool to another accurately. They know how far to leap, and they know which direction to avoid making a leap of faith and ending up stranded on the rocks. So the question arises, how do they know which way to jump and how far to jump? Turns out they memorize the tide pool zone at high tide. So a few hours later from this photo, when the tide has come in, they can swim down into the nooks and crannies, get a feel for the topography, memorize it spatially, and then somehow they're able to translate that sort of aerial view, if you like, into a horizontal view when they're at low tide and they're in these tide pools. And they're able to use that, what we call mental map. They're able to use that mental map of the area to successfully and accurately jump away through tide pools. You may ask, why do they do this? Well, if a heron or an octopus comes along, a predator, they want to move, and so it's a very useful adaptation to avoid being somebody's meal. So, captive studies done in New York City, of all places, over a couple of decades, found that they can memorize a tide pool zone in one day, and they can remember it 40 days later without any intervening experience with the same tide pool zone. So it's a pretty impressive piece of memory work for a little fish. I've already mentioned cleaner wrasses. This is the blue-striped cleaner wrasse, is the most famous of these fishes who make a living on the reef by cleaning and removing parasites and other undesirables from the skin and the mouths and the gills of so-called client fishes. It might behoove a cleaner wrasse to keep track of time and to recognize individual clients, to know how long it was since they last came. It almost looks like an addictive thing for some individual clients, where they will visit their cleaning station so often because they love the attentions. It feels nice to be fussed over, and they may also get some of those caresses that I mentioned earlier. So if it behooves these cleaner wrasses to know how long it's been since a client last came, because they're going to know how much more parasite load and how much potential potential food there's going to be. Perhaps they have a pretty high cognition and they recognize things and can keep track of time, and maybe they can even recognize themselves. And so they were subjected to the so-called mirror self-recognition test, which until recently was limited to big-brained mammals and a bird, a magpie. And it was thought to be a very high, and maybe in many circles, it continues to be thought as a very high level cognitive skill. And lo and behold, the cleaner wrasses passed the mirror self-recognition test. They couldn't see a colored gel dot on their chin unless they saw themselves in a mirror. And when they saw themselves in the mirror, they would regard themselves, they would orient themselves in such a way they could see the dot, and they would sometimes swim down to the substrate below and try to remove it. Pretty clear indications that they were recognizing. There's some debate over this. People are not ready to accept that a fish can do this well. In about 20 minutes, I'll be showing you a study of ants who appear to also recognize themselves in mirrors. So it gets complicated, and you know, it is open to interpretation, but it's compelling stuff. It's fascinating stuff, and it makes you really scratch your head. What on earth is going on? How much more is going on inside these animals' minds than we thought? Archer fishes, there's 6 different species, but they're all named because they use water as a tool, as a ballistics tool. You may have heard of this, and they can squirt water about 3 meters, and they are very accurate at knocking crickets off of leaves, as shown here. They also can squirt water quite accurately at insects flying over the top of the water. And depending on the distance from the water, they use different techniques. They may use a predictive tracking where they're squirting water ahead. That's for insects flying further away. If the insect is flying within about 7 inches, they will turn and shoot, where they rotate their body at the same time. So it's a flexible behavior. It's also known to be learned by observation. A young archerfish who's never practiced this before and isn't given the opportunity, but only can watch videos of other archerfishes doing this, or real life archers doing this. When they're finally given the opportunity to try it themselves, they will perform it much better than if they had not been given any of that prior exposure through observation. This implies observational learning, and perhaps you might even argue perspective taking. These are also highly regarded cognitive skills. Now, because archerfishes have this remarkable, beautiful, brilliant behavior of squirting water, why not present them with touch pads over their tanks to test an old idea, which is a claim of many aquarists, people who keep fishes in tanks in their homes, that they recognize me, they know it's me. There's lots of anecdotal accounts, and this study from a German lab published in 2016 found that, yes, indeed, when you reward an archerfish for squirting water at a familiar face presented over the tank, they soon learn, they learn a familiar face, and you can present them with faces without hair, as on the left panel here, faces also without ears, as in the middle panel. I have to say these faces look pretty similar to me, and yet these archerfishes can be presented with 40 faces, 40 unfamiliar faces, or 39, in which one familiar face is randomly placed, and they will squirt water at that one familiar face. So they have superb individual recognition. This speaks to an animal not just with a brain, but with a mind. I was also fascinated to learn that fishes have been presented with a number of optical illusions that are effective on us. They fool us. This is the Ebbinghaus illusion, in which the 2 orange circles are the same size, but because the arrangement of blue dots of different sizes around them, the one on the right in this case looks like a larger circle than the orange dot on the left. You can train fishes of various species, and they have been trained, to get a food reward for poking their nose against the larger of 2 circles. And then when you present them with this, randomized of course, lo and behold, you find that in this case, that fish is going to go up to the dot on the right and poke that dot to get a food reward. They perceive, just as we do, that the dot on the right is larger than the one on the left. I think this has some profound implications. It shows that they're not robotic, that a robot would perceive them as the same size. At least I suspect they would. I don't know if anyone's tested the Ebbinghaus illusion on a robot, but a thinking, feeling, perceiving animal is fallible. I mean, deception is widespread in nature, and deception works because animals can be fooled. And so this fish, it shows that these fishes can have beliefs, and those beliefs can be wrong. How human of them, I think. What about the interrelationships between fishes? Those two can speak a lot about what's going on in their inner lives. Here's an example. Fishes have been shown to be subject to what we call the face inversion effect. That is, that if they're presented with a familiar fish's face that is being turned upside down, they have difficulty recognizing it. In fact, I think they don't recognize it. We also have difficulty recognizing a familiar face. Not that these two pictures are familiar. I should probably put an upside picture of Jane Goodall or somewhere on there, or maybe David House. But we struggle with that. Chimpanzees do not, probably for the simple reason that they get more practice at it in the wild. Animals tend to be good at what's useful to them. Case in point, the frill-finned gopher we saw earlier, who can hop from one tide pool to another. It's an important skill to have, and evolution has, dare I say, seen fit to have them be good at it. Here's an amazing, I think, revealing interrelationship on reefs. And this is a relationship between two large reef predators, a grouper on the top and in this case, green moray eel on the bottom. I don't know if green moray eels are the only moray species to engage in this symbiosis, this cooperative, collaborative behavior, but in any event, certainly the greens do. They're a very large eel, but these two fishes have different styles of hunting on the reef in as much as the grouper is a big chunky fish in the open water, and the eel is more like a ferret who's able to swim into the nooks and crannies. So the two fishes go out. Oh, and I should mention a critical part of this relationship is it involves referential signaling on the part of the grouper. A grouper will swim out to a moray eel, and not just any old moray eel. It's probably a particular moray eel they know and they've worked with before, and will perform a head shake. Sometimes a whole body shimmy. And this is interpreted by us and presumably by the eels as an invitation. I'm hungry, let's go foraging together. Will you come with me? And off they go. And once again, there are YouTube videos of this as well. And it works because their collaboration is very productive, because a poor target fish who they've identified is really unable to have a good strategy to avoid both of them. If the fish flees into the matrix of the reef, well, then the moray eel can go after them. And if the moray eel fails to catch the fish because it darts into the open, well, you know who's waiting there. And groupers will also point to fishes who darted into the reef if the moray hasn't seen that, and they will go face down, pointing face down, and they'll wait for up to 23 minutes. I think is the record that's been observed by us. They will swim over to bring the moray eel. So there's a lot of intent in this behavior. And it's estimated that they, based on observational studies, that when they collaborate, they have about up to a 5 times greater success rate in getting food, getting fed, than catching fish than if they don't work together. I mentioned it's not willy-nilly, it's not just any old partner, and there's support for that based on some captive studies done at Cambridge University, where laminated, realistic-looking eels who were laminated between plastic and could be pushed and pulled on pulley systems, and therefore could be made to be more or less cooperative. A grouper who had worked with an uncooperative eel the previous day, and perhaps also a cooperative one, would choose the cooperative one the next day. So they remember what happened the day before, and they know who's a more productive partner to go with. I've mentioned the cleaner client mutualism a little earlier in the context of mirror self-recognition studies, and also that stress study of the striated surgeon fish. Perhaps I should have showed this slide earlier before those, because it provides some background context, but this is one of the best studied and frankly, arguably, certainly among the most complex mutualisms in nature. And it's the cleaner client mutualism, in which, in this case, cleaner wrasses, though there are other species, there's even some shrimp who do cleanings, will clean a wide range of so-called client fishes, including sharks, manta rays, and also non-fishes such as sea turtles, I think also sea snakes. Certainly a very wide range of clients. Clients will wait their turn. They will queue up, just like customers at the barbershop, to have their turn, to get fussed over. You can see there's a great deal of trust here, with a little predatory fish like this porcupine fish opening the mouth, allowing the cleaner wrasse just goes right in. it's not a good way to maintain good business relationships if you eat your business partner. And I don't believe there's any known case of us seeing a cleaner being eaten by their client. And they go in and out the gills where annoying parasites may settle, and they're plucking away at these parasites. It does get Machiavellian. Sometimes cleaners take more than they should. They do what's called mucus nipping, where they take a little mote of that slimy protective layer on the outside of the client. Whether it hurts or not, I don't know, but clients will tend to jolt. They will do a body jolt when this happens. That may signal to the cleaners that they've overstepped the line. It also may signal to other clients in the queue that these cleaners are not doing the best job today. They're taking liberties. And this may also relate to this caressing behavior that the cleaners may do, where the cleaners may realize that they've, to put it bluntly, pissed off their client, and they want to mollify the client. And so they'll take a break from cleaning and will caress them with some pectoral fin flutters. The shoddy cleaning is more likely to be done when there's fewer clients in the queue. This has been shown through careful studies. And mollifying behavior is probably also more likely to be done. I don't remember if that's been measured. So as you can see, it's a complex thing. I suspect there's well over 100 published papers on this mutualism, and new discoveries happening with it all the time. Can fishes be virtuous? Well, yes, I think they can. And here's a couple of examples. Here we have 4 species of rabbit fish, and you can see that in each case they're foraging in as a pair. And note that while one is head down, quite vulnerable, plucking away at algae, which is their food, on the reef, there's another one playing lookout, face up, not feeding, delaying gratification, looking out for a moray eel or a grouper or some other danger that could come along, and ready to signal quickly so the two can flee to safety. And it is virtuous behavior for the lookout, because of course they are delaying gratification. They're going without food for the time being. As I'm sure you will figure out, you would have figured out, they switch places after a couple of minutes, and so everybody gets to feed, or both in the pair get to feed more safely, thanks to the other being there to help them. This is a still photograph from a video of a quote unquote, and I want to emphasize quote unquote, feeding frenzy with some sharks. It was filmed with selfie sticks, or whatever you call them. And, you know, we like that term feeding frenzy. It fits our view of sharks, that they're kind of just food driven and sort of not, they're kind of just, the more they can get, the better. Well, here's an interesting situation. And if I was comfortable showing videos in my presentations, I would show a video here, because it conveys more than this still photo does. But this still photo it is taken at the moment that the shark on the lower right, the one facing left, has just grabbed a piece of food in this chumming situation. And the one on the left arrived a bit late and is inadvertently about to chomp down on the nose of the one on the bottom right. And in the instant after this photo was taken, the shark on the left, who I have to say this is anthropomorphic of me, looks a bit surprised there, opens his or her mouth as wide as possible and quickly turns the head away, averting what would have been a nasty bite for the one on the lower right. Suffice to say, this shark on the left went to great lengths to avoid biting his or her comrade. And you know, I think it's uncharitable for us to use the term feeding frenzy. These animals are aware of what their situation is, and they're not out to harm each other any more than they're really out to harm us. I just read an article saying that shark attack is a poor descriptor of what happens. It's a mistaken identity. Sharks seem to regard human flesh as the equivalent of how a lot of kids regard Brussels sprouts. And because sharks also respond to gentle caresses, they can be trained, if you like, to come and sit on somebody's lap, somebody they know. Christina Zanato, in this case, she's a dive instructor, and they will come and rest their heads on the lap and be petted. And by getting them into this super hyper relaxed state, the technical term is tonic immobility, they can be manipulated, and that includes removing hooks. This wild blue shark, had this quite ponderous hook and line cut out with bolt cutters shortly after this photo was taken. There's even some suggestion anecdotally that the shark may know that the humans can help them. And so it's certainly relief for a shark like this to have a big hook like that taken out, as you can imagine. A little bit about the implications with regard to our relationship with fishes. It's been a bad one. I mean, and it continues to be a bad one. And I think some of the reasons why might be that fishes, we don't hear them. We don't hear the sounds they make. They actually make a lot of sounds, as many species like grunts and sea robins, who are named for their sounds, which are produced in any number of ways. They also don't blink. They don't need to, because their eyes are constantly bathed in water. Perhaps these sorts of characteristics, plus just the fact that they're alien to us because they're breathing underwater and we can't live there, and they can't live where we do. These may all have contributed to our impoverished attitude towards fishes. And because there's a lot of us and we're hungry, we've caused a lot of fish declines, as you can see. And fishes in their habitats face a lot of existential threats: climate change, in particular, warming oceans, ocean acidification. Coral bleaching is a result of some of these problems, and the enormous problem of plastic waste, mostly plastic. Fishing gear to the tune of 640,000 tons per year lost or discarded in the waterways worldwide. That's an estimate, of course. And then the insidious problem of tiny ocean plastics, which look just like fish eggs, and these little fish like this pike consume these and is unable to digest them and usually perish. So these are all problems, but far and away the biggest issue here, the vast majority of animals we kill are to be eaten. So it's our food choices which have the biggest impact on populations worldwide. We don't know how many, we don't know how many individuals, but estimates are conservatively in the hundreds of billions of fish a year killed for human consumption, or to feed fishes in aquaculture operations. And possibly over 1 trillion. And it's also not only a cruel way to die in a net because of crushing or exsanguination or suffocation on the boat deck, or decompression, being raised from the depths quickly, but it's also an incredibly inefficient one. This is a close-up photo from a shrimping boat off the coast of Mozambique, and you have to look pretty hard to find shrimp in there. There are some, but there's not many. And most of you probably heard the problem of bycatch, which is unwanted species who are usually dead or dying by the time they're tossed back into the water. So it's a terribly wasteful thing. Estimated 200 million pounds of bycatch is produced in the fishing industry every day. Shark finning is worth about $108 per fin. It was by one estimate, and a shark who's left to swim around and for ecotourism is worth close to 2 million over the lifetime of that shark. So certainly there are good economic arguments for leaving them alone. Just want to throw in, it's also the commercial fishing industry is certainly got a lot of human rights violations. If anyone's seen the recent film Seaspiracy, there was some interviews with people who had been essentially enslaved on fishing boats for years at a time, often unpaid and ill-treated, and sometimes killed. Fortunately, there are choices, certainly for those of us in developed nations, with companies like New Wave that are producing plant-based fish. And there's also, as you may know, a growing industry producing cell-based, which is now beginning to be sold in some restaurants around the world. Well, Singapore anyway has recently crossed that very telling threshold. And there's products like fishless fillets from Gardein. No fish had to die for this product, and yet they're very tasty and quite decadent. They're not exactly health food. Last slide before we change gears here. I just got this chart from a colleague of mine in Germany recently, and if you look at the right side of the chart, there's a 5-year constant decline, or pretty constant decline, in the export of fish into Germany, out of Germany, and the import into Germany, to the tune of 28% and 24% respectively. So, as for cause of that, there's been speculation that the German consumers are actually more cognizant of fish sentience and maybe moving away for that reason. That's nice. I hope that would be a great reason. There may be some other factors at play, and more years of data are needed to show how much and whether this is a real trend. All right, big gear shift now. We've gone through some fish stuff, and now we're going to go through some insect stuff. there's an incredible rise of interest in invertebrates all of a sudden. This is very heartening to see, but octopuses are being celebrated in a number of best-selling books, and there's squids and nautiluses, articles all over the place, and of course spiders, insects, and the big arthropod groups, hugely successful, are coming into the conversation as well. I attended an entomology conference a couple of years ago, and there was actually a session of several speakers on the ethics of insects, various ethical issues. So insects have been around since before the dinosaurs. They're ancient. They're an incredibly successful group of animals. They make up about 8 out of 10 of all living organisms on Earth in terms of species diversity. And there's estimated to be about 10 quintillion of them living on Earth at any one time. And an estimate of, a rough, crude estimate, of course, 1.4 billion for every human. And it's estimated that the total biomass of termites on the planet today is about 10 times the total biomass of humans, and the same can be said of ants. These are, of course, estimates, but they speak to the incredible success and numerosity of these creatures. Do insects have feelings? We don't know, of course. It's the hard problem of science. We don't know what's going on inside the body and the mind, if there's a mind at all, of another creature. Do we throw up our hands and say, well, it's not worth studying, as seemed to be the attitude last century? No, we don't do that. The science can reveal a lot of surprises and make us scratch our heads, and perhaps influence how we think and how we make policies. Do insects feel? Well, we certainly know they have very good senses. This big-headed fly, as you might imagine, has very good vision, sense around vision, all the better to find a female to mate with. This is a male, and it's the males who tend to have the big heads. Probably a joke in there somewhere. Crickets have been shown, if you put them on a hot plate, this is a metal plate or ceramic plate that can be heated up or cooled down, and as the heat gradually goes up, they will run off it when it gets to a particular threshold, a threshold that is essentially shared with other individuals of the same species. If you give them morphine, a pain reliever, the hot plate gets hotter before they'll run off, so their sense of, dare I say, pain, nociception, is dulled. If you then give them an antagonist, a drug such as naloxone, which reverses the effect of morphine, they will once again run off the hot plate sooner. So certainly in terms of responding to pain relieving drugs and pain inducing drugs or pain canceling drugs and the like, they respond in a manner that is supportive of the idea that they can feel pain. A recent study showed that flies who have had one leg amputated 3 weeks earlier show us a prolonged hypersensitivity to, as shown on the hot plate test. They will run off the hot plate sooner if they've had a leg amputated 3 weeks ago than if they haven't, and this continues for some time afterwards. Do these studies show that they're feeling pain, that they're experiencing pain? No, they don't prove that. Science doesn't really prove anything. It accumulates evidence in support of the hypotheses, but it's compelling, and it makes us scratch our heads and makes us think that there's some support here for the notion that just because you're a lot smaller, and I think humans are guilty of sizeism here, smaller organisms we tend to discount and think they don't have the complexity to be able to feel things. Donald Griffin, a great 20th century ethologist, made the point that a couple of 100,000 neurons in your head, in your brain, such as some flies have, allows you to have more connections than there are grains of sand on Earth. So there's incredible computational potential from what we would regard as relatively modest numbers of neurons, a couple of 100,000 compared to, I forget how many tens of billions I think that we have, or maybe it's trillions. I should get that number memorized, but suffice to say they've got a lot less than us. Doesn't necessarily mean they lack certain capacities. There's been a number of compelling studies done by Robert Elwood and others on crustaceans, which also support the sense of pain and a desire to relieve pain. And I certainly recommend those studies for people who want to delve deeper into this. Intelligence, are insects intelligent? Can they be intelligent? Ooh, let's see what they can do. This is an image, a three-dimensional image of just part of a fruit fly's brain. And I just like to show it because it does certainly show differentiation and complexity. I learned it was just a simple ganglion when I was an undergraduate biology student, but What I've read recently paints a very different picture from that. They have differentiated brains that do different functions, and there's a lot of complexity. Most of the studies of cognition in insects are done on the Hymenoptera, the honeybees and the bumblebees and the ants. They're very numerous and convenient for one thing, but they also, the famous dance of the bees is certainly a remarkable phenomenon that tells a lot about the complexity of these creatures. Bumblebees have been shown to learn to can learn to pull a string to get access to a nectar reward in the middle of a quote unquote blue flower, blue not real flower. They pull it out, this blue disc out from under the plastic roof, and then they can get access to that. And a bumblebee who watches this also learns to do it much faster. So there's observational learning in addition to problem solving going on here. Bees have also been shown to have a concept of zero. If you train them to go fly to a piece of paper that has 1 or 2 dots compared to 3 or 4, you reward them for going to a smaller number of dots, and then present them with a blank page compared to a page with some number of dots. They'll go to the blank page. This is indicative of a complex, what we would call a concept of zero. Again, we don't know exactly how the fly is perceiving this and processing it, but they seem to have this logic that a blank page is less than a page with 1 or 2 or 3 dots on it. Flies also have, well, now we're moving to flies, a different group of animals, a different group of insects. Flies have an attention span. Studies by Bruno van Swinderen in Australia show that when you put a fly, and this is a tethered fly with electrodes in the head. By the way, I just want a disclaimer, I don't necessarily endorse all the methods used in the studies I cite. Nevertheless, if somebody's done them and they've been published, I think it's helpful to use the data to hopefully get us to think about them in new ways. And in this case, this fruit fly is able to fly, albeit in one direction. And then by having the fruit fly in a rotating drum, you can present them with different stimuli. And the brain has a burst of activity whenever that plus sign comes by. But as it continues to go by every few seconds, the burst of activity lessens. It appears that the fly is becoming tired or bored, or what scientists would maybe say habituated to that same symbol. And then you change the symbol to a square or something else, and then there's a new burst of activity. These are kind of hallmarks of having an attention span. Another hallmark is being distracted, or being less distracted when your attention is diverted, and more easily distracted if you're getting tired of the same stimulus. They've tested that as well in a picture of another fly off to the side. This fly is much more likely to notice that if they become tired of the same stimulus. Studies with fruit flies show that they can do what we call rational decision making. Females' choice of males to mate, they tend to choose males who are chosen by other females, even if the scientists have experimentally been able to show that an actually not very desirable male is very successful with getting matings. Females notice that, and they tend to practice the quote, "I'll have what she's having." Transitive inference, I had to write that down because I wanted to remember what I wanted to say. Paper wasps will have shown the phenomenon of transitive inference. I won't describe the study, but essentially this refers to the phenomenon. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then logic holds that A is greater than C. And wasps and flies have been shown to be able to make that inference. Highly social animals, Hymenoptera, once again, paper wasps, they actually each have idiosyncratic different individual faces like we do. And they recognize a face, and scientists who mess things up by artificially jumbling up a familiar face, that face gets rejected. So we have face recognition in colonies of paper wasps. We may have that may be quite widespread in other species, although I suspect it would need to be, well, I don't know. I mean, consider that it's probably pretty dark inside nests. So this sensory ability may be mainly at play during the day when they're outside the actual hive itself. I mentioned earlier a mirror self-recognition test in ants, a study. This was published by 2 Belgian scientists in about 2016 or 17. I was gobsmacked, frankly, when I learned of this study. It really is surprising. So let me just briefly sum it up. So they presented ants of, I think, 2 or 3 species in one genus with mirrors and with glass plates, and they put marks on their heads, and they sought to see how they would respond. The segment A, top left, this is an ant who is seeing herself in a mirror, and she stops and she's waving her antennae, responding very differently to the ants in section B, top right, where it's not a mirror, it's a plate of glass, and they're seeing other ants running on the other side. They don't stop to regard them. But when they saw their own reflection, they did. In section C, plate C, the ant has had a blue dot applied to the front of the head, and the ant is trying to preen that dot off. In section F, bottom right, the ant has had a blue dot put at the back of the head, not the front. The ant can't see that in the mirror and is not trying to preen it off. So there appears to be an awareness of what they're seeing in the mirror is themselves, that they have a blue dot on the head. If you have a control with a brown dot, as in segment E at the bottom left, the ant ignores, presumably unable to notice the dot because it's camouflaged against their own body color. Another study with, in this case, tool use and tool modification by ants. You give them various substrates or various materials with different degrees of absorbency, present them with a plate of diluted honey in this case, and they will select tools that are most effective at absorbing the liquid and thereby carrying it back to the nest. In this case, they soon learn to choose the green, bottom left at the upper plate, the green pieces of sponge, and they would break them into smaller pieces if they were too large, because the sponge becomes very heavy when it's laden with sugar water. So we have tool use and tool tool modification going on here from ants as well. There's a lot of other studies coming out all the time that could be described, and I'm only scratching the surface here. And indeed, it's only relatively recently that scientists have been asking questions about how animals think, and does an insect have a cognitive life? A little bit about interrelationships of insects and what they may reveal. You may have heard about the symbiosis between ants and aphids, and how the ants act as a police force, protecting the aphids in return for drops of honeydew that the aphids liberally give them, sweet liquid that they love to eat. There's a study that appears to be an example of what we might call self-triage in ants. These are Matabele ants, African species, the number of species in the group, and they tend to specialize on raiding termite colonies to get their food. And some termite colonies have formidable defenses, and a lot of ants get injured to various degrees. And ants workers, uninjured workers who are returning from a raid, who encounter an injured comrade, will pick the comrade up and carry it back to the nest where it can be nursed. Careful studies show that that injured ones who are not nursed have about a 20% survival rate. Individuals who are taken back and nursed have a 90% survival rate. So it makes a big difference, and they can actually sometimes go on future raids. But what's some other nuances to this, though, is that the injured ant, as you can see here, is cooperating by holding all her limbs in close, tight, so she's easier to carry. They practice self-triage because severely injured ants who know that they're not going to survive, they will not cooperate this way. They will wave their legs, spread them out, and be difficult to carry, essentially informing their comrade, don't bother, don't waste time with me because I'm going to die. Not to assume that's the thought process, but putting it in human terms, that seems to be what's going on. So you might call it self-triage. The flowering plant pollinator relationship with insects is of course a huge and probably the most important symbiosis on the planet by far. To put numbers on it, about 94% of all flowering plants are pollinated by some kind of insect, usually many kinds of insects. And in terms of human value, it's valued at over $500 billion a year, the pollination services to humankind. So it's a very important symbiosis. And of course, it works by the the insect getting pollen and nectar in return for the pollen transport services to the flower. And it's not just that, it's not just Hymenoptera like honeybees, but many different kinds of insects as well, especially Diptera flies are very, very important pollinators, such as this hoverfly here, who's evolved to look a bit like a wasp, which gives them protection. This is Batesian mimicry. They're less likely to be attacked by looking this way. Can you spot the fly? There's actually 2 insects here pollinating, or there may be some others, but the one on the top actually is a drone fly, and you can see this is a very strong bee mimic. They look a lot like a honeybee. That's a bumblebee at the bottom. So good is the mimicry that some honey producers have mistakenly put pictures of drone flies on their labels, thinking that they were honeybees. No honey will ever issue from this insect, but who's to know? And there's deception in this relationship between flowers and insects. There's some orchids, such as this one, that mimic a very tempting abdomen of a female fly to male bees who are drawn in there. They pollinate without getting any nectar reward in this case. So they're kind of hoodwinked, but the plant certainly benefits. Just to finish up with then a few implications for the insects now. We went through some for fishes. This is a term you might see, bugpocalypse. I just saw an article in, I think it was the Guardian magazine, that was saying how, oh no, it was, I think Toronto Star recently, just saying how a new study out of Europe, somewhere in Europe, maybe Germany, estimates that more than we were thinking, the insect decline is even worse than we thought. But suffice to say, it's very rapid. It's going on quickly. I won't read these, you can read. So that number, 50% at the bottom, may actually be an underestimate. This is very alarming because aside from everything else, one can make more intrinsic moral arguments about the intrinsic value of insects, but just in terms of benefit to us and benefit to ecosystems, they're absolutely vital. Flies and insects would flourish without us, but the opposite cannot be said. Ecosystems would collapse without them, and we'd go down with them. So why are they declining? Well, certainly pesticide use is a major problem, but we now come back to the same issue we came to before. It's food choices. Loss of habitat is a huge reason for this. And it's food choices that contribute to that, because if people choose to eat animals, the animal agriculture takes up about 80% of farmed land in the world and produces less than 20% or about 23% of the calories. It's an intrinsically inefficient way to produce food for human beings, and it's wrecking things for fishes, and it's wrecking things for insects, and where that goes is going to wreck things for us if we keep doing it the way we've been doing. We have these big monocultures that are essentially ecological deserts for most organisms. Certainly you won't find any fish there, but also you may not find anywhere near as many insects or with the diversity that would historically be on that land. And yeah, we need to grow plants if we want to feed humans, but if we're feeding them to animals, as so much of the plants grown are fed, then it's a very inefficient system that we need more land taken away from natural habitats. This is just an example of what individuals can do besides changing their eating habits, but you can also buy little nest things for, in this case, mason bees, nest holes, and they will hopefully take to that. I haven't tried it myself yet. I'm living in a condo, but if I moved out to the country, I want to get one of these and see how it goes. But I have practiced bee rescues. If you find a bee downed by rain, for instance, this bumblebee, cold and wet and unable to fly, I took her back to my apartment, gave her some sugar water, and the tongue came straight out. She drank it and tanked up, and then weather had already cleared. I let her out, and they have good navigational skills. So I hope that she was able to find her way back to her colony, and it's a real feel-good experience to do that. So I recommend it to others. A librarian in England found a bumblebee who had apparently been grown up without wings, and she took it under her wing, and it would probably this beautiful insect would come out to take food from her, and she developed quite a relationship with it. And I think we can do better with our relationships with other animals, not just insects and fishes, but all animals. And I think if we have a more compassionate relationship to them, compassion is indivisible. and we'll have a more compassionate world in general, with more compassionate interactions with each other. That's the kind of world I'd like to live in. And I think the fish would say the same thing, and so would the insects. I will stop there, and thanks for listening. And I look forward to some questions.
Jonathan, thank you ever so much for an extraordinary tour of these far borderlands of sentience, these far borderlands of life that we've just been, too ignorant of for too long. We don't hear fish. They don't blink. These are inhuman kinds of characteristics, and therefore we have this ignorance of them. But I have a question for you as an ethologist. Ethologists are interested in the study of animal behavior. And if I can just make an analogy, within sociology, you can talk either about behavior or about action. And behavior is just sort of stimulus response, whereas action is informed by intention, by meaning. And it took a struggle, but sociologists weaned themselves from just studying human behavior and became interested in understanding human action. Now, it seems to me that you becoming interested in the inner life of all these creatures, have gone against your own profession. And do you see it that way, or do you see a fundamental empathy, if I can call it that, amongst those interested in animal behavior?
I certainly felt like a bit of an outlier when I was a graduate student way back. I was usually the only vegetarian, ultimately vegan in the group, and but I was never shunned, and I also felt a comradeship to some level, but that was also a little bit of a barrier to me. I feel like I'm, even though I'm not in academia in my day-to-day life, I feel like I'm seeing a loosening of the traditional views of animals, and a flexing of the traditional views of animals. Just the fact that scientists are asking questions, really interesting questions, about feelings in animals, about sentience in animals, which inevitably have moral consequences, because I regard sentience as the bedrock of ethics. The reason we have ethical systems is because others' lives matter to them, and their lives can go well or ill, and we can have an effect on them through our own actions. And I think those kinds of broader philosophical implications are coming more to the fore now that scientists are studying things like sentience, feeling, emotions, cognition in animals. So I think there's a shift. I feel less different from my academic colleagues than I once did.
And I'm going to use my power as moderator, to be immoderate for a bit. And yes, I see there are questions there, and I'll get to you soon enough. But I have some burning questions that I want to address. In the Middle Ages, there was the institution of the bestiary, and the bestiary was sort of these fables, often about animals, which were seen as having superior powers to humans. The eagle's sight, for example, vulture's smell, but also the spider, with their incredible industriousness. And so there was a recognition of, if you like, virtue, and also a recognition of superhuman powers then. So I have two questions that go along with that. Do you think from that high point where all of these animals, and there were other things as well, or very much had to do with morality, like the pelican supposedly piercing its own breast to feed its young with blood. There was all this. Much of it fantastic, much of it, we would say symbolic, but was there a higher respect or a more intimate knowledge of animals then? Did that decline, and now we're seeing a comeback? Would you see that as possible, or no? Is it only since people like yourself have been really looking into this field of animal behavior and making the discoveries that are being made, that we've come to a more informed understanding?
Yeah, great question. I'm not really a historian, so I can speculate. My sense is that our overall collectively our view towards animals has been an upward line. Our treatment of them hasn't. We harm and kill more than ever, partly because there's just more of us and we eat them. But I would say, in terms of our attitudes to, our appreciation of them, our awareness, our knowledge of what they're capable of, while there may be pockets of enlightenment in our history, where certain tribes may revere certain animals and the like, nevertheless, I think collectively as a species, we are more advanced, dare I say, today in terms of our interest in and our awareness of animals as more than just things than we ever were in our history. There was something else I was going to say there, and it escaped me.
Okay, well, but just on that point, some indigenous societies see animals as people. The Makuna, for example, of the Amazon, understand fish to be people. And when they go down to their longhouse under the water, they take off their skins that make them look like fish to us, and they go about as people. So, that kind of, is that anthropomorphism? I'm not sure. It's a kind of recognition of sameness across species. So that idea of personhood is just a given in the relation with animals, whereas a huge legal struggle for us to try and get to the idea of recognizing, just for example, the personhood of apes. And so I'm going to let you, please.
Oh, I was just going to briefly say I listened to a couple of podcasts that have the theme of animals in the law. One is called the Animal Law Podcast. The other one is called Paw and Order. And thanks to listening to those, I'm quite aware of the immense legal wranglings and struggles and campaigns that are going on to change the legal status of animals, especially getting them standing. So that's good to see. That's a very active area, and so many bright young people coming up through academia and going into that growing field. That gives me some hope too.
I would have to agree. Teaching at a law school, I'm really impressed by animal advocacy that goes on there. There are human rights, and that's involved a great struggle. And now, increasingly, there are notions of animal rights and getting beyond the species that has otherwise stood in the way. But I think that, it's really on account of this idea of sentience that feeling, right? That seems to be what makes the breakthrough. That idea of sentience, if that creature feels, then I can't treat it with impunity. And I think, with fish, we have this impression of them being unfeeling. And why is that? Well, they're not furry. And I'm just wondering, why do fish get such a bad rap? Because they don't evoke empathy in the same way that a furry pet might do. And yet they're interested in caresses too, and I'm intrigued by this, what that implies.
I think it's another brand of xenophobia. We're just that much more removed from them in terms of their fundamental living spaces. We go and swim in the water, and we as kids, we breathe water through our nose, it hurts, and we maybe almost, we swallow water and we have that horrible, scary reaction where we think we're going to die because we could drown. I think, that early lesson underscores our alienation from that environment, how different from us they must be, that they can live in that area. And they're swimming under the ice in the middle of winter, and it's so cold, and, we can't help being anthropomorphic. We live in our human bodies, and we think how different, how alien their lives are. I mean, I do reflect on that. I think of these fishes living under the ice all winter, living here in Southern Ontario, as I do right on Lake Ontario. It's like, it's kind of alienating, but look at what the science shows. It shows these mental mapping and stress relief, and, as you say, caressing, and it's a wake-up call, and it's a reminder that we need to keep our biases in check, because when you look closely, lo and behold, there's so much more going on there than we thought in terms of thinking and feeling and sentience and experiences, etc.
Okay, well, I'm going to defer to the audience, and I'm going to allow them into the conversation a little bit because I have more questions. Jonathan, you have mentioned YouTube videos several times and briefly remarked that it is only through new recording tools that we are learning about the skills and intelligence of other species. From Natalie Doonan. I should note that she teaches in a department of communication. Hence, I think her interest in recording. Well, but anyway, her question, do you think or have you come across any research that shows that anthropocentric understandings of other species interpret the value of other species only as they serve human ends are changing as a result of our access, through such recordings? So is the kind of, the consciousness that you're talking about really dependent on advances in media?
I don't know if anyone's doing that. I know there's a lot of media studies out there, and I'm sure that YouTube is I would think is a goldmine of potential data collection. I don't know if anybody's creating YouTube videos specifically to measure responses, but I think could be eminently doable. So I generally feel, despite all the misinformation and so-called fake news and such that can be spread through the internet, I like to think maybe it's the Pollyanna in me, if there is one, that on balance, it's for the good. For instance, there's a series of YouTube videos called True Facts about Z. Frank. I don't think he's a biologist, but he's erudite and educated and immensely funny. So these wonderful true facts about the octopus, true facts about the duck, true facts about the naked mole rat. There's probably 20 or more now, and I recommend them to people because they are not only enormously funny and entertaining and quite irreverent in places, they're also chock full of really interesting scientific facts. As a writer of popular science, I have learned that the facts get to hear, but if you want to get to hear to people's emotions and feelings, which I think is where behavior change is more likely to happen, and you got to go beyond facts or beneath them or wherever into stories. And so we do need more than facts. We need stories and personal accounts, which is why I try to include a lot of them with my writing and some of them with my presentations. So I don't really have a very good answer to your colleague, I'm afraid. I like to think, and I hope, and I'd love to learn about YouTube being used as a way to measure people's attitudes towards animals and how they might be changing.
Just on that point, Jonathan, you have a line, a fish has a biography, not just a biology. And hence, your passion for telling stories. I find that a beautiful line in terms of opening up this idea of biography. And we want to come back to the bios in just a moment.
Okay, if I could just credit the American late philosopher Tom Reagan for saying that. I'm paraphrasing him there. So credit to Tom Reagan, wherever you are, for drawing that nice image.
It is very powerful. Stephen Harned, a really difficult question. How far down the tree of life do you see sentience? What is the boundary? Okay.
I know Stephen, and just like him to ask a difficult question. That's a great question, a really important one. I would quibble as he might with the word down. We do tend to be hierarchical in our views of creatures, and who says which way is down. But I understand what he's saying. I'm a human. I grew up with the hierarchical thinking as well. So where do you draw the line? Back to Tom Reagan, he said, wherever we draw the line, draw it in pencil, because science is always bringing up new information that may cause us to revisit where we drew it last week and where we would draw it today. So I don't have a magic answer to that question. And the more we study smaller organisms, the more complexity we find. But currently, with what we know, I would be very surprised if a bacterium is sentient. They just don't seem to have some of the key criteria, anatomical and physiological and the like, for sentience, or never mind a virus, which I think there's some question whether they're even a living organism. So certainly, I shouldn't say certainly, nothing is certain in this domain. But if we can say that we can say comfortably that a bacterium is not sentient, then presumably there's somewhere in the chain of life, hierarchical or not, where sentience is expressed, where it begins, if you like. But I don't want to venture where to draw that line, because the line already is different now than it was, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Now, this question from Mark Patterson goes to bios, to life. It's a complex question. Let me put it to you. And it has to do with filters. Like, what are we picking up on when we are looking at animals? Mark asks, with the increasing awareness of studies of the complexities of animal behavior, is this a way of privileging human constructions or filters of cognition, sentience, and so forth? Those ideas originate with the human. That is, an anthropocentric perspective doesn't value life in itself, but only particular similarities with us. And so, that to value life in itself, biology, loving and knowing life, and not only these constructions, as Mark puts it, of cognition or sentience. How do you feel? Are you anthropocentric still by looking, for these things?
Yeah, this speaks to a bit of a conflict or a paradox in my own approach. I tend to present information that is about, to sum it up, it's sort of like, wow, look what these animals can do in terms of thinking and feeling. And there's this kind of tacit gold standard, or the tacit assumption that the human is the gold standard, and look how like us they are, look how good their memory is. Really, that apropos to the question, that is intrinsically kind of anthropocentric, and it's unfortunate, because I don't really want to convey an anthropocentric message. I think it's so, I think one of the most humbling realities that we can be aware of is that none of us has any control over who we are born as. And I don't just mean whether we're born into poverty or which part of the world we're born in. I'm talking about species. We have no say in that. You could have been a dragonfly, David, and I could have been a naked mole rat, and maybe that would be a pretty cool existence. Who knows? We'll never know. But we should take some humility from that we don't have any control over who we're born as. And if we can look at another organism, however alien they may be to the life of a human, we can muster a remarkable capacity we have, which is empathy. We can muster that empathy and relate to that animal and say, okay, look, I'm an individual struggling to get through the vicissitudes of life, and so is this individual. And I hope that kind of thinking will bring us closer to them, and will ignite our huge capacity for empathy.
Mm-hmm. On that point, Christiane Bailey puts another difficult question. I'm sorry to make your life so difficult this afternoon, but these are wonderful questions. Christiane asks, and let me give you the example that she gives as well. Do you think that we have moral duties to design structural interventions in nature to help wild animals? Okay, so in other words, given this empathy which you speak, and puts this question: what do you think about the reducing wild animal suffering movement, which is the UAS? Argues that the lives of most wild animals is terrible and not worth living. Do you think that there is a predominance of suffering in nature? And if so, is it an argument in favor of intervention? I guess we're not just talking here about an animal that's caught in a trap, and whether it would be more humane to kill the animal than to let it continue suffering. But beyond that, there's a judgment here in the RWAS about the value of life, animal life. It's not worth living in their estimation.
Yeah, I actually differ from that Hobbesian view. I'm not saying that the questioner necessarily has that view, but I know it's kind of a widespread assumption. I would say the predominant assumption that there's more suffering than feeling good in the world, in nature. I would take issue with that. Often, for many creatures, they may die young, but even a creature who dies young, the cause of death can be very sudden and short-lived, and there was a life that was lived before that. So that's sort of like the calculus of whether life's worth living, and that's a whole interesting question in itself. But I don't think we should assume so glibly that life is more suffering than feeling good or feeling neutral. Just one other thought I had with the earlier part of the question is the whole thing about whether we should interfere with nature taking its course. You know, we hear that expression, you know, there was an animal, you know, there's an animal an elephant who's lost its trunk in a snare and they're going to die or they can't feed themselves. Let's just leave it and let nature take its course. Or an animal a wild animal who's crippled or what have you, but could be healed. Well, it's easy to forget that we're nature too. Humans are nature. So the argument could be made that the intervening human is nature acting, because I'm a product of nature. And if we choose to intervene, well, we're part of nature doing that. So the argument could be made where humans are part of nature, and so we're extending what qualifies as nature, and that helping an animal is good luck for that animal that we were there and able to help. And that was part of nature at work too. So I don't think we should so readily say letting nature take its course is the moral position. I think some level of interference. Now, does that mean we should stop lions from catching prey and try and make them all be vegetarians? No, I don't believe we should interfere in that way. But situations where an animal is in dire need of help, often we cause it to be in that situation to begin with anyway. All the more reason that we can judiciously interfere and try and help them.
Another question for you. You speak of the other minds problem as the hard problem, but that's not it. The hard problem is explaining how and why sentient species feel, rather than just do what needs to be done for survival and reproduction without feeling a thing, like robots, which can also learn and remember and avoid damages. So, you know, the other minds problem, Stephen is saying, is not the hard problem. The hard problem is explaining how and why sentient species feel, rather than do just what would need to be done. You know, so this is something unusual, you know, this capacity of feeling.
Yeah, that sounds very much like a Stephen Arnad question. I know Stephen, and he's a very insightful thinker, and I don't know if I have an answer to that question. I'm not sure it was a question. I think it may be in a declaration.
Okay, very well. You know, and a number of people have expressed appreciation for fascinating and thought-provoking talk, including your response. If I can intervene, you know, one of the things, I mean, here I am at the Center for Sensory. You know, sense perception really interests us here. And, you know, there are a number of animals that have super sensory abilities, you say. And, you know, in that regard, not only was there the bestiaries where, you know, the moral virtues of some animals, the idea being that we should emulate them, like the pelican or whatever, you know, were exalted, were emphasized. But this idea of supersensory powers, like, you know, for example, would we have come to understand radar had it not been for the bat? You know, the bat was an inspiration for a whole technology in that regard. And you know, those supersensory powers, and electricity is another one of them, from what I understand. But would you comment on, you know, the super sentience, as it were, of some animals?
I've often wondered about that. My way of framing that is that given that we know that certain animals, many animals, have far more acute sensory capacities in certain sensory domains than we have, there's a sobering follow-on to that, which is that that pain may be on that list. They may be able to feel pain more acutely than we can, and perish the thought, given the way we treat so many animals. There was another point I wanted to make, and it slipped my mind as well. But I do think it's a sobering thing that we should be mindful of, is that we, just as we know we're not the pinnacle of, say, being vision or smell or even touch, we may well not be the pinnacle of pain sensation. The other point I just remembered I wanted to make is that a philosopher made the case, I forget which philosopher it was, it may have been Reagan or Singer, that an animal, their pain may be psychically worse because they don't know why they may not know why it's being inflicted, and they don't know when it's going to end. We may know we're going to turn the electric shock off in 10 seconds, but they don't know the end of when the end of their pain may be coming, and that may actually make it qualitatively worse for them.
Goodness. Now, this question follows on from that. It comes from Anne-Sophie Blouin. What do you think about the difference between some biologists make between pain and nociception? They sometimes use this differentiation to say insects and other invertebrates don't feel pain, even if their bodies have nociception.
Right. Yeah, I probably should have been spent a little more time on that important difference. Nociception, as I understand it, is the physiological detection of a stimulus, but without, let's say, a noxious stimulus, but without the qualitative experience of pain in the animal who feels it. So, for instance, when we're under general anesthesia, our bodies can be terribly insulted surgically without us experiencing any pain. So we know you can be a conscious organism and yet feel no pain. So there are states when that can happen. And I think of that as a little bit of a crutch. Often that's used as an excuse to treat animals in all sorts of bad ways, is because it's just nociception. They're not actually experiencing pain. Their bodies are registering a noxious stimulus, but it goes no further than that. And I think that's partly why there's a great value and a need for some of these studies that I mentioned today. While they may not ultimately prove pain, they make it pretty hard to deny it.
Going along with that is your fascination with pleasure. And I do think that that's unusual because, you've gone out of your way to sort of bring out how different creatures can achieve satisfaction. And to me, that's neutral, right? Like, you've got pain or you got pleasure, according to the utilitarian calculus. You go towards one and you avoid the other. But sort of like with the caress, you seem to be carving out a space which is just concerned with pleasure seeking, but not, like more for other reasons, okay, if I can put it that way. Like, part of the thing about a caress is that it's social. A caress involves someone else, some other entity. Now, some of those fish that have been poisoned or whatever can still get back their sensitivity by rubbing their mouths on the gravel. But, that was really interesting, that idea of just enjoying the stroking, enjoying the interaction. And, maybe I'm just not familiar enough with the literature, but it seemed to me you were charting something different there. Okay? And it was, seeking satisfaction, seeking pleasure as an end in itself because of the sociality, rather than the goal-directed nature of the typical calculus. Now, maybe I'm not framing this very well.
No, it's. I'm glad you're broaching it. We need to talk much more about pleasure, and I think a lot of this is kind of the continuum that we can think of is the pain being at one end and pleasure at the other. And of course, pain is multifaceted. There's physical manifestations of pain. There's psychological manifestations of pain. Similarly with pleasure, there's physical and psychological aspects of that too. Each, I think, is equally rich. And each, I like to think, a bit of an assumption here, and I'm not a physiologist, is served by the same anatomy and physiology that the other is served. If you're equipped to feel pain, I would argue that you're probably equipped to feel pleasure as well. And so with that stress study, for instance, with the striated surgeonfishes who were stressed out and probably very unhappy, unhappy is not a word you're going to see in a biological journal. Scientists are not comfortable about saying happy and unhappy. They may over a beer at the bar say that I'm willing to accept that animals may be able to feel that sort of sense of happiness and unhappiness, but I'm not ready to say it in this academic paper. But is it stress relief only? Is it the cessation of a negative feeling that the surgeonfish is going for when they go to get caressed? Or is it actually to move beyond that midpoint, that neutrality, and get into the realm of pleasure? Well, I would say, why does it have to be one or the other? I think they can be mutually consistent. Is that in the act of becoming less stressed, we're probably maybe experiencing pleasure. We may end up in a higher plane of pleasure than we're used to being in. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think they're all interacting phenomena, and that there's a spectrum, an integrated spectrum of the whole pleasure, stress, joy, happiness, and the opposites or the negative expressions of those.
So sort of a multi-dimensional, not a
Yes.
zero-sum game, not a zero-sum game, but all kinds of different trajectories that we could and should be looking at.
And one could argue that pleasure, just as consciousness, is viewed as an emergent phenomena. That those students of evolution know that evolution has no goal in mind. It has no goal. It's it's adaptation through competition and pressures and such. But pleasure is nature, as I like to say, it's nature's way of rewarding good behavior that benefits survival. So there's very good reason. There's the same robust reasons for the evolution of pleasure can be recognized as for the evolution of pain. Does that mean they're equal morally? I don't think so. I don't think we have any moral, just a moral obligation to bring pleasure to animals. It's nice if we do, just as it's nice if our neighbor gives us a gift. But we do have a moral obligation to not inflict harm. That's a whole different thing. Just as our neighbor shouldn't come and deflate our tires in the middle of the night, what have you. Pain and stress. I think you get the point.
Now, one manifestation of the kind of empathy that you're describing is having a pet. Pets who are treated as family members, for example, there's an extension of the bond of kinship. And so Brian Lynn asks, what is your position on pet ownership? Do you feel it is right or ethical?
First of all, I tend towards the more recent lingo of companion animal guardianship. It's more syllables, but I don't like the idea of ownership. I think we, certainly legally, we need to move away from that, and maybe in terms of the relationships we have with our companion animals as well. Yeah, I have a lot of misgivings, but I'm not fundamentally against people cohabiting with certain animals. I mean, certainly the domestic dog is probably, I think, a bit of a special case. They've become so integrated with us. They read our signals so well. We read them. The intercommunication is so great. And to see dogs the way they look up at their human guardian, they're glad that part of their social history. They like to be part of a group, part of a pack, to belong. I regularly see dogs who are really, really feeling good about their situation. I think that the dog-human relationship has a lot of good about it, and I'm not ready to say we shouldn't have dogs. Not at all. Of course, there's a lot of bad situations too, but those are individual cases. Cats are a little bit more problematic, I think, but you go beyond those two. Rats are terrific companion animals. I've had rats myself. So, you could go through the list, but, fishes, if you learn about the aquarium industry, there's a recent film came out called The Dark Hobby, which is all about the hidden ills of the aquarium fish industry. They don't belong in tanks. I don't support that. I don't agree with that. For many of us now, with our flat screen TVs and our Netflix streaming accounts, we can actually play long-running videos, constant videos of fishes swimming around a reef, and so you can have that without actually having fish anyway. So that's another example of an alternative. So my feelings on keeping companion animals are mixed. I think there's some good aspects to it, and there's quite a few bad aspects to it.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for plunging us into another universe and bringing to our attention, so many examples of forms of awareness, forms of feeling that we were ignorant of. And now, that you've brought them to attention, we have to really ponder hard. And, partly we can do that through changing our language, like instead of ownership, talking about companion animals, and that's one way. And I just want to go back, if I may, to that point I was making at the beginning about sociology, stopping looking at social behavior and looking at social action. Social action is full of meaning and intention. It gives agency to the people that are behaving, not like its paradigm of looking behaviors. Interestingly, often compared to ants. I'm not going to go there because that's wrong. But my point is that a long time ago, I read the works of Van Uxkol, and Van Uxkol was a biologist who had a whole theory of meaning in his understanding of the way in which animals perceive the world and communicate. So there was a semiotics there, and we're not just talking then about sentience, about signals and decoding signals and so forth. And instead of dissecting animals, what Van Uxkol was really concerned with was life of animals, and seeing them as having meaningful universes. Really, I think his biology is still a model for us, to understand in terms of meaning transfers and animals having meaning as well as pain and as well as all the other faculties that you've described. So this has been a wonderful start, to our series, and the next talk is not until the middle of October. We had to allow some time for grant applications being submitted, and so we're skipping a bit of time. But this has been a wonderful start, and I just want to say how much I've appreciated your work, both as an author but as an activist, and what you have done in terms of raising awareness and changing practices in your own practice. So, first of all, I'm not sure how long you've been back in Canada for, but welcome back from Florida. Southern Ontario is a wonderful place to be, and I'm sure that there are lots of wonderful, sort of things to study in that environment. Thank you so much for joining us today for this talk, which is so very stimulating and such a wonderful experience for all of us. You can't hear the sound of clapping because we've got the web in our format here, but I know on behalf of everybody here this afternoon, this has been an amazing trip. Thank you very, very much.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So I'll invite people to watch out for the next lecture in our series, which is about sound art. And it's actually about wiring nature and engaging with the sounds that nature produces as if it were an electronic keyboard. So till then, I wish you all a very good